Greetings, class. Welcome to your second lecture for the week, second recorded lecture. Keep it short. Ran a little longer than I had told you I would last time in introducing the work of Karl Marx. This second lecture is going to be dealing with the both theoretical and real world failures of Marxism, talking about the transformation of Marxist thought, more like the appropriation of Marxist thought by other schools, by other disciplines, and sort of in the social sciences specifically, and the use of these types of sort of just borrowing the oppressor-oppressed framework and just applying it all sorts of different places, and that the centrality of that in the postmodern world of theory. So, because we are not going to spend any of our remaining time talking about that stuff. So let's take care of Marx, and then I'll set you up for what we have Monday. So, I told you last time we were going to talk about Karl Marx's the failures of his theories, and we can basically break these into two different types. And you might say that one informs the other, or that if there's a problem with your theory, then this will be reflected in what we see in the real world, and sure. But let's just start first with theoretical problems. And some of these I had already touched on when I spoke to you on Monday. So, of course, the first problem is with his labor theory of value. Now, this was something that he had essentially derived from the classical economists, Adam Smith, but principally Ricardo. Okay, which we didn't talk about David Ricardo very much, but so let's just review here. According to Marx, the value of a commodity was determined by the socially necessary labor time required for its production, and the surplus value created by the unpaid labor is the source of profit in capitalist systems for Marx, and this is is exploitation. And so the problems here. By the late 19th century, you have great economists such as the Austrian Karl Menger, who's pointing out things like the marginal theory of utility, which is now just a cornerstone of any kind of real economics that you're going to study. So, demonstrating that value is subjective and that it's determined by individual preferences rather than labor input alone, which sounds fairly obvious to us, but at the time, this was a pretty revolutionary concept. Remember, economics was still really in its infancy, moving through the 19th century. And so this undermines the labor theory of value as a universal explanation for price formation. So that's very critical, right? That's a critical problem with your theory. Circular reasoning, also known as sort of begging the question here. Because Marx's analysis of surplus value presupposes what it seeks to prove. Marx is assuming that labor alone creates value, but he fails to account for other factors that create value, things like entrepreneurship and capital, things that also contribute to production. And then, of course, the different value that people will ascribe to things, or even the different values things may have in different times, different places. And this is like, if you want to look up the diamond water paradox, or actually, just really quickly, again, I am going to keep this short, but so the diamond water paradox, it's a very famous example, a diamond or a glass of water. Well, all of you sitting comfortably right now watching this in your dorm room, or wherever you are, will say, well, of course I would like the diamond. But if you're on a desert island, and there's no water anywhere, we'd trade a whole bag full of diamonds for a glass of water, right? So, okay. Empirical evidence, the real world data as a result of these theoretical failures just wasn't lining up with Marx's predictions. So the value of goods and services was not directly proportional to the labor invested in them. So economists were just able to see this. And so this leads into the more real world failures, because again, economists are looking at the data here. So yes, looking at the world, right? Sorry, let me go back real quick. So, a couple of other problems, and these were things that had been noted in the real world experience. I'm not going to get to like the big failures yet, but this was just a couple of things that they had noticed theoretically in the small experience they were running. Number one was the incentive problem. With no private property and no market competition, there was it wasn't clear how people were going to remain motivated to produce and to innovate. And then later, members of the Austrian school point out that there will not be an effective price mechanism, which will allow you to effectively allocate resources. And again, these theoretical failures are going to be borne out in the real world. But these are just the theoretical problems. So, and this will be my last one here. Before I go to those real world examples. Again, Marx had argued that history was unfolding through dialectical materialism, this process that was driven by the class struggle between economic groups. Everything had been reduced to socioeconomic groups. And this deterministic framework was supposed to imply inevitable progression from feudalism to capitalism to socialism and then eventually to communism, the disintegration of the state and the rule of the individual democratic communes making all productive decisions together. However, history did not follow Marx's very rigid set of stages. Societies have taken many diverse paths, and capitalist systems have proven far more adaptable and resilient than Marx had anticipated or that socialist systems themselves had. So, let's go now to some of the major failures that were observable. Number one, and I talked about this already last time, the rise of the middle class. Remember, Marx had predicted the polarization of society into a very, very small bourgeoisie. Remember, people are being forced off the countryside. Everyone's a farmer. 99.9% of us are farmers. Some of us are starting to be displaced off the land. We're moving into the cities. This is happening more and more. Agriculture is becoming mechanized. Yields are going up. More of us are employed in industry in the cities. And this is breaking up the old relations, the old sort of anchors of local identity. And it's pushing us all into a place where we're all alien. We don't share anything with one another in the cities except our socioeconomic standing. That is, we are all paid laborers. And so there's that this small impoverished laboring group, that wage laboring group, is going to grow larger and larger and larger, and there's going to be this huge gap between the huge proletariat and then the handful of bourgeoisie, and eventually the proletariat would overthrow them and rule. And so this is of course not what happened. Instead, the 19th and 20th century saw the rise of a substantial middle class in the industrialized nations. Wage growth. Workers' wages have generally increased in capitalist economies due to technological progress. Total factor productivity increases. And so this is, again, contrary to Marx's belief that there would be worsening conditions. Wealth distribution. Broadening property ownership. Again, Marx did not believe that there would be this ownership society. So this property-owning middle class. So, failure of revolutionary predictions. Remember, Marx believed that, and I talked about this last time on Monday, Marx believed that it was a progression, and that only the most advanced industrial societies would be ready for that final revolution, the push to socialism, to communism, to the quote, end of history. So instead, what happened? So he believed it would happen in countries like Germany or in England. Instead, what did it happen? Happened in the most backwards, non-industrializing countries. Happened in places like Russia, China, Vietnam. Places where Marx's framework wasn't applicable at all. It flew in the face of Marx's framework. So, he also did not anticipate that industrialized nations would essentially, and I talked about this last Friday, with regard to the creation of the first welfare state in the New Germany by Bismarck. And I told you that what happened was Bismarck and other conservatives, actually it was the conservatives in England also who started us down the road of the welfare state there. But it was this effort to say, okay, we will concede what sort of the moderate let's call them like the moderate social democrats. Let's just call them that. They're not the communists. They're not the ones who are trying to revolutionarily overthrow the government by armed force. They're essentially saying, look, we will give you things like health plans or pension plans, retirement plans. We'll allow you to form unions, things of that nature, as long as you participate inside the process. And so they basically are able to put those who refuse to play along with this, who are actual revolutionaries, out on an island where they're completely isolated and can be, subject to either irrelevance or police coercion or whatever the case might be. So, sometimes combinations of both. So this is what's happening here. So, you also had the collapse of socialist states. You had Marxist-inspired regimes that implemented these planned economies. And what did they suffer from? They suffered from inefficiency, from corruption, from authoritarianism. The Soviet Union, for example, most famous example, struggled with chronic shortages, waste, lack of innovation. I don't even have time to go into the problem there with the internal market there, but there were, of course, many. This led to a lot of global disillusionment with the Soviet system, even before then, because of the human rights abuses that came out from the Stalin period, which George Orwell had tried to warn fellow humanitarian socialists about, and no one wanted to listen to him in the 30s. But the role of state power. Marx believed the state would wither away after the establishment of socialism, but instead, what we saw was the expansion of state power. And specifically, Marxist governments often created the most centralized, most authoritarian state, rather than empowering the proletariat in this labyrinthian network of participatory democratic Soviets ruling themselves. And Soviets were workers' councils. So imagine each shop had like elections, and then they made decisions there, and then all the little Soviets, all the little councils would get together and vote in like a Congress of Soviets, right? That's not what actually happens, though. You just have these dictatorships of a lot of times of one man. So, or like a small clique. Last one here, and I already touched on this, but Marx failed to understand capitalism's adaptability. We talked about things like the concessions that were made to sort of the moderate. I don't know how. I don't really want to put a label on them, but these were people who wanted to see social reforms, changes in the structure of society, in the distribution of wealth, in the legal system. Remember, I told you that, like, in England, if you had a job in a factory and you failed to show up for work for a day, like, you could be thrown in jail or fined by the government. So it's not what we're thinking today at all. Labor relations were different, and then of course it was different in every country. But you saw the government would often the government of these established property holders and power holders would grant concessions at times of crisis to the leaders of the masses who were asking for essentially just concessions within the established framework of things. So they were never going to concede things to people like Lenin, right? But they would concede things to more moderate, sort of middle of the road type socialists. So like the Saint-Simonians, for example. So let's see. Yes. So yes, and of course these concessions undermined the sort of the revolutionary impetus that Marx had envisioned, as did the rising standard of living. So you had the creation of the welfare state and the rising standard of living created by industrial capitalism. If you've ever watched like the show like Downton Abbey, for example, the average person today enjoys a standard of living that the wealthiest person in that show could have imagined, right? So it's really incredible what capitalism has been able to do in terms of raising our standard of living. And if you look at countries around the world, even regimes that don't allow participatory representation, things like in China, for example, the fact that the regime has been able to increasingly lift the standard of living higher and higher and higher, it really just diffuses that move, that impetus to risk the increasing material comfort that you have for political representation, because what would you do with it? Your position has been getting better and better and better. So don't really have time to go into development theory and all that, but so just to wrap this up here, as far as the theoretical and observable real world failures of classical Marxism, unreformed Marxism, anyone who studies political the evolution of political economy, the thinking surrounding that, needs to know Marx. And of course Marx's name is still, and his critique of capitalism remains influential in academia. But really, if you look at the United States, anyone but the most marginalized of leftists, those who actually read the Communist Party weekly circular, all they really want is more social democracy, which is basically just welfare state capitalism, which is more or less what we have now anyway. And classical Marxists, both because of the theoretical and real world failures we've talked about, don't really exist anymore outside of a handful of graybeards in academia, like Richard Wolff, who I think he's at, was he at Amherst? I think so. So while you do hear a lot about, Marxism or Marxists today, what you're really going to be hearing about are people who have taken Marx's basic oppressor-oppressed dichotomy and applied it to other sets of relations, like race, gender, sex, etc. Before I talk about these postmodern intellectual movements or pseudo-intellectual movements, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that these late 20th century schools do something Marx would not have. They reject capital T truth. Marx was himself a product of the Enlightenment. His methods and doctrines are of the Enlightenment. He believed he was discovering the objective truth about the world, about people, about how everything worked. Marx is the peak of capital M modernism, the belief in the ability to apply human reason to problems of political and moral philosophy and to come up with answers that lead inexorably toward perfection, or the end of history is what he describes it as. So this is not what the postmodern project is about at all. It fundamentally rejects the modernist project, even though contradictorily it cannot but use the language and methods of modernist thought. But that is a topic for another time, probably a topic for another class, as we are just about done here as it is, closing on the end of the semester. And I don't plan on spending any amount of our remaining time talking about things that have added nothing to the sum knowledge of human civilization, other than what I'm about to say right here, right now, just to give you some context for when people talk about cultural Marxism or they're Marxists or something like that. Like this is what they're talking about. This is what it means now. So by the mid-20th century, the cumulative impact of all the failures that we've just talked about had seriously marginalized the classical Marxist. Within academia and political movements, adherents either abandoned Marxism altogether or sought to reformulate it. The Marxist-Leninist states that remained often diverged significantly from Marx's original vision, prioritizing nationalism and state power over the class struggle. Again, I would ask you just take a look at China today. In the West, the dominance of Keynesian economics and welfare statism rendered Marxism increasingly irrelevant. And even within socialist movements, figures like Bernstein or Husserl championed more democratic reforms and market-based approaches. Well, not so much Husserl there, but definitely Bernstein. Diverging from Marx's revolutionary prescription, essentially saying, like, we can vote our way to what we want. There's no need to be revolutionary about it. So, despite the decline of classical Marxism, one of Marx's core ideas, the dialectic of oppressor and oppressed, survived and found new applications. In Marx's framework, this dynamic was, of course, defined by economic class conflict. The bourgeoisie oppressed the proletariat through control of the means of production. Over time, though, the dialectic was expanded to analyze other forms of social hierarchy and power. This has been applied to race, for example. The civil rights movement, subsequent critical race theory, came up with things like institutional racism, and white privilege, which was to echo Marx's analysis of class privilege and structural inequality. So if you're familiar with classical Marxism, it's very easy to see these things. Gender, of course, feminist theory. This would be mid-second, third-wave feminist theory, also incorporated this oppressor-oppressed framework, framing patriarchy as a system of male dominance over women. Marxist feminism specifically examined how capitalism and patriarchy intersect to exploit women, particularly in labor and in reproduction. Identity politics. So this is where intersectionality really gets going here. Identity-based movements, using this oppressor-oppressed model to analyze and experience the experience of marginalized groups. Most specifically today probably would be like LGBTQ plus, indigenous peoples, and of course others. So this broadening of Marx's framework shifted the focus from class struggle to more pluralistic understanding of power and oppression within the social sciences there. So while this evolution is going to depart from Marx's materialist, sort of high modernist scientific attempting foundations, it's going to retain its emphasis on systemic critique and the advocacy toward structural change. Sort of ironically, though, of course, these new identity politics movements, ironically, sort of fragment the oppressor-oppressed model into multiple identities, sort of weakening its potential to get anything done, really. For Marx, it was just, in classical Marxism, there were two. There was just the bourgeoisie and the working class, whereas identity politics emphasizes all the differences within the population. And so, I had said that one of Marx's famous phrases was, "The working man has no country." And what he's saying here is, don't get distracted by differences in language or nationality. He would have said the same thing about religion, except pretty much everyone was Christian, and the difference between Protestants and Catholics was becoming less and less important at the time of his writing. The Catholic Church was a bastion of reaction against these things, but against these social movements. But generally speaking, so that's one of the, I think, very apt criticisms of identity politics, even coming from the left. Someone like Marx would say, this is crazy, you're completely missing the whole point here, which is to build a unified movement against these things. And yes, there may be small differences within the working class, but you're all being exploited by the owners of the means of production. So that's what he would have said. But that's it. That's it for Marx. Those are the sort of the grandchildren, great great grandchildren of Marx. We are not going to spend any time talking about them. As I said, many of these books on the shelf over here are, Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault. I've spent so much of my life, many hours of my life reading those books. I'm not even going to pretend like there's anything useful in them at all. You could fill the totality of what they add to the project of civilization on a note card. So we're going to talk about Nietzsche next week. And he is going to be, I think, a really good place to kind of start wrapping things up. Because for Nietzsche, and I don't want to give too much away here, but he is going to embrace power. Power as the measure of all value, as an end in itself. Because for Nietzsche, whatever you want to do, you have to have the power to do it. And we'll also look at his pronouncement of the death of God, which is largely misunderstood, and the rise of the new religions, most specifically nationalism, which, as I said at, I believe, the start of our time together, is the most successful political philosophy I think that's ever been invented. We've looked at lots of different forms of government. We're now at the point in the 19th century, especially in the latter half of the 19th century, where the national idea is going to seize hold of Europe and the West in a very ferocious way. And it's going to, again, in the high capital M modernist sense, they're going to apply, rigorous scientific methods to it, trying to figure out what constitutes a state, whether it be historical precedent, ethno-linguistic homogeneity. So it's going to be very interesting these last weeks here. I will post this lecture as well as your reading for Nietzsche in case any of you are feeling particularly ambitious over this weekend. Monday, I will give you a primer on Nietzsche and kind of bring you to the point where we are looking back on the 19th century, the period of history that had seen the most dramatic transformation of the globe ever in human civilization. Remember, at the start of the century, the fastest way that you could get a message from one point to another was the same way that it had been back in the time of Jesus. You got a guy on a horse riding as fast as he can. Maybe you've got horses staged along the way to speed this up if it's a regular, route. Now we have the telegraph, we have the telephone. We have photography, we have cars, we have tens of thousands of miles of train tracks going everywhere. We have steam power, we have explosives. It's just, and again, sort of maybe the reason I'm kind of tending toward the sort of the more explosive element is, of course, most of these things are going to be applied toward the increasing of state power and will be applied to the making of war, World War I, which is going to really mark the end of the modern project. This is going to be the end of all illusions that the application of reason and science is always going to lead to better and better outcomes, because World War I is a cataclysm unlike anything that's ever happened, and it destroys all illusions. And so that obviously will take us beyond the scope of the class, but for those of you who take 20th century European history with me, that is one of the things that we spend a good deal of time talking about. So, I will wrap this up. I am cognizant of not taking up too much of your time. I know it is Thanksgiving break, and I'm sorry that I had to make these videos for you, but we did need to keep pushing on. I hope you enjoyed them. And I look forward to seeing you on Monday. So, have a great weekend.